Welcome, my friends, to the Bob and Brad podcast. My name is Mike Keenitz, and I'm a PT assistant. Today, I am interviewing RT Hill and Niraj Vora from the Stride Shop. Both are physical therapists, and they own a running clinic in Baton Rouge and New Orleans, Louisiana. So we are going to talk about different running injuries and how to work through them and different exercises you can try to fix these problems. So without further ado, here are the gentlemen from the Stride Shop. So I think we're going to get on to strength training for runners and why runners should do strength training, because back in the day, it was not recommended. So what do you guys recommend for strength training?
All right. I'll jump in on that one as well. Yeah. So that tide has turned. It used to be, if I'm a runner, I just need to run, and that's all I need to do. And I think that has now become pretty well documented and pretty well shown that runners need to be doing some form of strength training, not just from a performance standpoint. If you want to run faster and have a better running economy and run longer, strength training is going to help for that. But then, while you can't say, well, this is 100% going to ensure that you don't get an injury, strength training helps to build a resiliency in your tissue so that you are able to take on more of a load and more activity without overloading your bones and muscles and joints and things like that. And so I think runners that are out there that are only running and never strength training, they're missing out. I think they're putting themselves at a huge disadvantage for those reasons that I said, right? Improve running economy, reduce fatigue, bone health, improved anaerobic endurance, right? Improved max speed. And it helps to break up a lot of times the monotony of just running all the time. So I'm for it. I'm all about it.
Anything you'd like to add to that, Niraj?
Yeah, I think, again, we think about this sometimes in a weird way, like, a pitcher, a baseball pitcher, or an offensive lineman, they strength train, right? They have demands for their sport and they strength train. And the same applies to running. There are demands. The sprinters strength train. Endurance runners should strength train in some sense. Running, it's one of those things where it's, beginners for sure, like the more you run, you see these huge changes right away, right? Not right away, but as you start into running, maybe you can run farther, maybe you can run faster as you start training. But running, from the sense of outside of performance, we talked a little bit about bone. Running's not really an osteogenic, a bone-forming activity. And so if you're just pounding on bones through this one form of input, you're probably at higher risk. We know you are as a high school athlete. If you specialize as a runner, you're at much higher risk, 7 times more likely, I think, to sustain a bony injury. So, from a viewpoint of healthy bones, yes, you should provide some resistance training. And the same applies to tendons, because if all you're providing is this kind of moderate plyometric input to tendons, you're not going to be sustaining tendon health the way that resistance training would as well. So it's like trying a different pair of shoes. It's like any athlete that trains doesn't spend 100% of their time training in their sport. You don't just a pitcher doesn't just keep throwing and throwing and throwing until they get better, right? So I think we just need to approach and look at it a little differently than we do.
Do you guys have any recommendations of like some basic exercises people should do if they're runners for strength training?
Yeah, I think we have kind of a recipe template that we start out with most of our runners, or anybody who kind of comes into the clinic, not just runners. We do some specialized stuff for runners, but basically you're going to do 5 primary movements, right? You're going to push things, you're going to pull things, you're going to do some form of a hinge, squat, and then carry. And so then when it comes to runners, we're specifically going to then do some type of focus on some single leg activity and making sure that we're hitting the calves as well. And that is something in addition to all of the toe yoga and the Mobo balance and all those kind of things that we've mentioned already. But yeah, I think if you can put together a push, a pull, a hinge, a squat, and a carry, some form of single leg and a calf exercise, you can have so many different varieties of workout routines that then it's just a matter of, from a physical therapist standpoint, appropriately progressing those exercises and those movement patterns once someone has proven that they have the capability to do so. I think it's Dan John that says that 80% of your training should be geared toward your sport. So about 80% of your training should be running, but then 20% should be dedicated to getting stronger. So if runners can get into the gym a couple days a week, that's a pro. That's a
Yeah.
win.
So you typically recommend like 2-3 days a week for runners?
Depends. If someone, I know there's
Depends
a lot
on
of
mileage and time, I suppose.
depends on mileage time. Are you in the middle of, right? So say someone's in the middle of a training cycle for Boston Marathon, New York Marathon, something like that. If they're in the middle of a training cycle, their focus needs to be more on running and hitting some metrics that they want to there. So we'll have someone do maybe one day a week of training during that time, or like a strength training. Still focusing on mobility work and stuff like that, but we probably take the strength training a little bit lighter during that cycle. But if they're then in the off season and they're not training for a specific race, well, that's a great time to let the body recover from the repetitive motion of running and really build up some power and some strength. So then we're going to recommend, well, let's try and get you in 2 to 3 days a week, and try and build up a little bit more muscular power during those times. So it's where you're at in your training and that kind of deal. But if you're just in an off season, or you're not necessarily looking to run a race or something like that, 2 days a week, 2-3 days a week.
Do you guys recommend, like, during the off season? I know some people, they'll focus more on like lifting heavier during the off season and like more repetitions during in season. Is that what you guys kind of do?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, it's probably a good way to go. I think that as your volume of running decreases, it's a good time to focus on your strength. As your volume of running increases, it's a great time to maybe dial back in the weight room and focus more on some mobility or some mechanics, things on one leg, stability, quote unquote stability exercises. Right? I think that that's a pretty smart way to go about it. I think our team mentioned too that when we work with runners, not only those forms of exercise, but if you want to boil it down to the simplest thing, it's that runners mostly are going to use their quadriceps, their calf muscles, and their lateral hip. And so if you've got somebody coming in saying, give me 3 things to train, we don't do an exam, we don't know where, maybe you need the most work, but generically speaking, I mean, I think that if you can train those 3 muscle groups, you're probably going to do pretty well.
Right. Yeah. I've gone back and forth between running and being a meathead lifter, so I'm kind of stuck in this in between. I'm like a very bulky for a runner, but
well, you're kind of one of the lucky ones, though. I think, right, because you're willing to go in and lift heavy weights, which I think can be super intimidating for someone who's never done it before. And then Niraj and I come on to a podcast and say, yeah, you need to get out there and start deadlifting. Okay?
Yeah.
One of the best things that you can do for it. And someone's like, cool, gonna do it. What's a deadlift?
Right. Yeah.
And so I hope that more and more people, runners specifically, get comfortable doing that. So then there's more people to kind of guide you into it. And I hope more therapists start realizing that this is something we need to be doing, right? Ideally, from a physical therapy standpoint, the end of your rehab should look pretty similar to what it would look like if you're going to the gym. That's the main goal, right? Is to be able to set you off into the wild and go in there and do all those kind of things. So, I think we got to take it on ourselves as PTs to get trained up and feel comfortable and teaching the mechanics of those types of things and helping get runners into those positions in a safe way where it's not as intimidating.
I would mention we're not talking about it today, but it's very important to work on your flexibility and mobility too, because I neglected that this last year while training for marathons, and my hip paid for it. So I've been focused on it now, but
yeah, there's only so many hours in a day. It's like, what do you spend your time doing a lot of times, right? And it's very much a moving target. Like you said, if you spent a ton of time marathon training, maybe you didn't have time to be in the gym as much, and you didn't have time to work on your mobility as much. And then, you get past the marathon and you reassess and you realize, I've neglected this, and so I'm going to spend more time on this. It's a moving target. There's not one recipe that's going to work for everybody, and it's not one recipe that for one person is going to work from year to year. I think it's important that we reassess those things too.
All right.
So in New Orleans, we work out of a gym with a guy's name's Brian Adams with Cypress Fitness, and he is he's a personal trainer, but he's got this extensive martial arts background and does some things when it comes to mobility. To your point here, Mike, of just really cool, really profound things, and he has all these sayings, like these analogies. And he gave one the other day. I'm going to rip it off from him right now, but he was talking to a musician, and he's like, if you're a musician and you can play 3 chords, right, on a guitar, that means you can play songs that include those 3 chords and only those 3 chords. Same thing if you have mobility that's limited to this small amount. If you have this much mobility, you can only do activities that require that much. But if we teach you more chords, now all of a sudden your song library gets wider and wider. And if we give you more mobility and we strength train, or we train those joints in that new mobility, now you have all these additional activities and positions that you can get in and be there safely. And I thought that was, for us down here, I was like, God, one day I'm going to come up with something like that on my own.
That makes good sense in my head. I play music, but I do drums. I don't do guitar. But
if I gave you 1 snare drum,
I want more drums than that.
1 snare drum.
You guys want to mention your website and where people can find you on social media quick before we get too in depth here?
Sure. Our website is thestrideshop.com. We've got blogs and some free resources and a newsletter that we think is cool. And we've also got an online course video series called Building a Resilient Runner that we think stuffs a ton of information into some 10-minute segments that can be helpful for runners of all abilities. And then social media, we are at The Stride Shop on Instagram and The Stride Shop on Facebook.